Hello everyone. This week we are going to talk about market failures and we learn how markets work through supply and demand in chapter 3. Now we are going to look at the cases where markets cannot actually work properly. So why we have market failures? Markets fail to produce the right amount of the product. Resources may be in that cases over allocated or under allocated. So we can divide market failures in competitive markets two categories. The first one is demand side market failures, and this demand side market failures happen when demand curves do not reflect consumers' full willingness to pay for a good or service. And the second one is supply side market failures. Then it may happen when supply curves do not reflect the full cost of producing a good or services. Let's start with the demand side market failures. Demand side market failures arise because it's impossible in certain cases to charge consumers what they are willing to pay for a product. For example, think about outdoor fireworks display. People enjoy fireworks and would therefore be willing to pay to see a fireworks display. But as you know, these displays cannot exclude anybody, like these are outdoors and in public. People don't actually have to pay to see the display because there is no way to exclude those who haven't paid from also enjoying the show. So therefore, private firms unwilling to produce outdoor fireworks display, because as it will be nearly impossible for them to raise enough revenue to cover the production cost. And the second one is supply side failures. And supply side market failures arise in situations in which a firm does not have to pay the full cost of producing its output. Think of a case that a company produces some harmful gases to the atmosphere, so like a coal-burning power plant. The firm running the plant will have to pay for all of the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that it uses to generate electricity by burning coal. But if the firm is not charged for the smoke that it releases into the atmosphere, it will fail to pay another set of costs, the cost of pollution. And this cost imposes on other people. This includes future harm from global warming, toxins that affect wildlife, and possible damage to agricultural crops down it. As you see, here we have some market failure that is coming from the producer side. The best way we understand market failure is to first understand how properly functioning competitive markets to achieve economic efficiency. So first we will understand how market outcomes are efficient, and then we will go through these market failures and why they are not efficient and why we have problems. So two conditions must hold if a competitive firm is to produce efficient outcomes. The first one, the demand curve in the market must reflect consumers' full willingness to pay. And the second one is supply curve, and the market must reflect all the costs of production. Okay? If these conditions hold, then the market will produce only in units for which benefits are at least equal to costs. It will also maximize the amount of benefit surpluses that are shared between consumers and producers. Okay? So let's start with consumer surplus in the market. The benefit surplus received by a consumer or consumers in a market is called consumer surplus. It is defined as the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing to pay for a product and the actual price that they do pay. The maximum price that a person is willing to pay for a unit of a product depends on the opportunity cost of that person's consumption alternatives. Let's give an example. Let's say Ted is offered to chance to purchase an apple. He would of course like to have it for free, right? But the maximum amount he would be willing to pay depends on the alternative uses of that money to which he can put his money. If his willingness to pay for that particular apple is $1.25, then we know that he is willing to forego up to, but not more than that, 1.25 of other goods and services. Okay, instead of buying 1.25, he can buy other goods and services. Paying even 1 cent more would entail having to give up too much of other goods and services. So his maximum money that he wants to pay, it is the maximum amount he's willing to forego up to buy other goods and services. And it also means that if Ted is charged any market price less than $1.25, is his maximum willingness is $1.25, he will receive a consumer surplus equal to the difference between the market price and his maximum willingness to pay, which is $1.25. For instance, if the market price is 0.50, like 50 cents per apple, Ted will receive a consumer surplus of 75 cents because he's already accepting to buy an apple by 1.25 cents, the maximum. And if the price is 50 cents, then the remaining amount, 75 cents, is his surplus. In nearly all markets, consumers individually and collectively gain greater total utility or satisfaction in dollar terms from their purchases than the amount of their expenditures. Okay? So here you see a chart. In this table, you will see 6 people, Bob, Barb, Bill, Bart, Brent, and Betty. All of them has maximum price willingness to pay, and there is an actual price, equilibrium price, on the third column, which is $8, and this is the market for bag of oranges. Okay? So, let's see. Notice that the maximum prices that these individuals are willing to pay represent points on a demand curve, because the lower the market price, the more bags of oranges will be demanded. True. At a price of $12.5, for instance, Bob will be the only person listed on this table who's willing to buy the bag of oranges, not the others. But when the price decreases to $8, more and more people want to buy bag of oranges. It's because, as you remember, this is because of law of demand. When the price decreases, more people want to buy the good. Lower prices also imply larger consumer surplus. When the price is $12.50, Bob only gets 50 cents of consumer surplus, right? Because 13 minus 12.5 is 50 cents. And when it's $8, he gets $5 of consumer surplus. When the price is lower, the consumer surplus is also increasing. Okay? So here you can see $13, 13 minus 8 gives $5 of consumer surplus for Bob. And as you see, consumer surplus is true for the people who are accepting the market price or above the market price. Their willingness to pay is above the market price. We cannot talk about a consumer surplus when a person wants to pay $7 but the market price is $8 because he cannot be able to even afford it. There is no negative surplus. There is consumer surplus is positive, and it's the amount where the people can pay the market price or they can pay above the market price. Let's see this consumer surplus on the graph. Here you can see the demand curve for bag of oranges. And demand curve D includes not only the 6 consumers, but many of them because it's continuous. The individual consumer surplus of each particular person who's willing to buy at the $8 market price is simply the vertical distance from the horizontal line that marks the $8 market price here. Okay, this line. And up to that particular buyer's maximum willingness to pay. So to obtain Q1 quantity bags of oranges represented, consumers collectively are willing to pay the total amount shown by the sum of the green triangle and the yellow rectangular, right? They are willing to pay that much because anybody here on the demand curve is accepting already that price, although the market price is P1. But as you know, any person here on this demand curve, on this point and paying P2, let's say this is $8, this is $13, Bob, is ready to pay 13, but if he pays $8, he just needs to pay $8. He doesn't need to pay the $5 extra. So thinking that way, this yellow rectangular has to be paid by the consumers, okay? If you buy Q1 amount at P1 prices, the total amount of money has to pay to suppliers should be this rectangular area. Okay? So it's actually very helpful because we know that this green area is okay. The consumers are willing to pay, but they don't need to pay as long as the market price is $8. So that is the consumer surplus. Here the rectangular area is the consumer surplus because anybody on this demand curve above the market price are willing to pay higher prices, but they don't need to because they just pay the market prices up until this yellow rectangular, and the remaining, the green area, is their surplus. So how we can find the area, this area, green area? It's very easy from a triangle's area formula. As the length of this side, let's say this is A, this is B, A times B divided by 2. So the total consumer surplus in this market, if the price is $8, will be A times B divided by 2. Okay? And you realize that consumer surplus and price are inversely related. So when the market price decreases, the consumer surplus will increase. Or in another way, given the demand curve, higher prices reduce consumer surplus, lower prices increase it. You can test it in any way. If, for instance, let's say the market price is $7, you see here $7. Now the consumer surplus is a bigger triangular area. Okay? Like consumers, producers also receive a benefit surplus in the market. This producer surplus is the difference between the actual price a producer receives and the minimum acceptable price that a consumer would have to pay the producer to make a particular unit of output available. Okay? A producer's minimum acceptable price for a particular unit will equal to producer's marginal cost of production producing that particular unit. Okay. Why it's marginal cost? Because think of the bag of orange case. So the producer's price, minimum price to accept should be to be able to cover the additional cost in order to produce that one bag of orange. Okay. So from that perspective, the minimum price that the producer will accept is the marginal cost or the additional cost to produce this additional bag of oranges. Here you will see different producers: Carlos, Courtney, Chuck, Cindy, Craig, and Chad. And when you look at that, yes, you see that the producers have different minimum acceptable prices ranging from $3 to $8, and there is a market price $8. Let's say here Carlos, as you see on this table, Carlos' minimum acceptable price is lower than Chad's minimum price, acceptable price. Chad is okay with $8, the minimum to produce that good, but Carlos is okay with $3. So what does that mean? That means Carlos is more efficient producer than Chad, by which we mean that Carlos produces oranges using a less costly combination of resources than Chad uses. The differences in efficiency between Carlos and Chad are likely due to differences in the type and the quality of resources available to them. Carlos, for instance, may own land perfectly suited to growing oranges, while Chad has land in the desert that requires costly irrigation if it's to be used to grow oranges. So as you see, that's for that reason Chad has a higher marginal cost of producing oranges. And the minimum acceptable prices that producers are willing to accept form points on a supply curve, because the higher the price, the more bags of oranges will be supplied. Okay, so if the price is $8, Chad will supply, but if the price is $7, Chad doesn't want to supply oranges because it's now cost of producing is more than what he gets if he sells that bag. Okay, so that's why there is a law of supply here. When the price increases, more suppliers want to produce the good. And here you can easily find the producer surplus on the graph. Let's try to understand this graph. On this graph, the market price is P1 and Q1 bags are produced because only those producers whose minimum acceptable prices are less than $8 per bag will choose to produce oranges with their resources. Those lower acceptable prices for each of the units up to Q1 are shown by the portion of the supply curve lying to the left of and below the assumed $8 market price. The individual producer surplus of each of these sellers is thus the vertical distance from each seller's respective minimum acceptable price on the supply curve up to $8 market price. Okay. So their collective producer surplus is shown by the blue triangle. Okay, here is this blue triangle. Why? Because let's say here, you accept $4, the minimum price, but the price of the bag of oranges is $8. This distance, because up until $4, you need to pay your costs. So to produce, sorry, I write it wrong. Okay, let's say here, $4, okay. Up until here, with that $4 per bag of oranges, you need to cover your cost. And the remaining $4 is your surplus. Because $4 is enough for you to produce that bag of oranges. It covers all the costs. That's your minimum willingness to accept. Okay. So given that idea, this all triangle, blue triangle, will show the producer's surplus. And the yellow triangle will be the cost of production. Cost of production. Okay. And as you realize from this figure, there is a direct positive relationship between equilibrium price and the amount of producer surplus. Given the supply curve, lower prices reduce producer surplus and higher prices increase it. Okay, if you pencil in a lower equilibrium price than $8, you'll see that the producer surplus triangle gets smaller. Okay, and the gaps between the minimum acceptable payments and the actual prices narrow when the price falls. In this next slide, we are going to look at how market outcomes are efficient by looking at from the terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Here in this figure, show the equilibrium price and quantity, P1 and Q1. Okay, and also there are regions, green triangle is the consumer and the blue triangle is the producer surplus. And the demand curve reflects buyers' full willingness to pay, and the supply curve reflects all the costs facing sellers. And the equilibrium quantity reflects economic efficiency, which consists of productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. What is productive efficiency? Productive efficiency is achieved because competition forces orange growers to use the best technologies and combinations of resources available. Doing so minimizes the per unit cost of output produced. On the other hand, allocative efficiency is achieved because the correct quantities of oranges Q1, that is the Q1, is produced relative to other goods and services. Let's try to understand when we say efficiency in the market. So there are two ways to understand why Q1 is the correct quantity, efficient outcome of oranges. And both involve realizing that any resources directed toward the production of oranges are resources that could have been used to produce other products. Thus, the only way to justify taking any amount of any resources like land, labor capital, entrepreneurship away from the production of other products if it brings more utility or satisfaction when devoted to the production of oranges than it would if it were used to produce other products. Okay. So first, let's try to see why Q1 is allocatively efficient quantity of oranges. You can understand this by looking at supply and demand. So demand represents the marginal benefit and supply represents the marginal cost. As you remember, the optimal allocation requires marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. And these two curves intersect at one point. That means they are both equal at one quantity Q1 and P1. So that from that perspective, we have the optimal outcome. And this is true because the maximum price that a consumer would be willing to pay for any particular unit is equal to the benefit that she would get if she were to consume that unit. True? That's why it's a marginal demand. Demand curve represents marginal benefit. So thus each point on the demand curve represents both some consumer's maximum willingness to pay as well as the marginal benefit that he or she would get from consuming the particular unit in question. And combining the fact that supply curves are marginal cost curves with the fact that demand curves are marginal benefit curves, we see that these points on the demand curve measure the marginal benefit of oranges at each level of output, while points on the supply curve measure the marginal cost of oranges at each level output. As a result, when marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost, where the demand and supply curves intersect, which means that the equilibrium quantity Q1 must be allocatively efficient. This is the first way. The second way to see why Q1, quantity 1, is the correct quantity of oranges is based on our analysis of consumer and producer surplus and the fact that we can interpret demand and supply curves in terms of maximum willingness to pay and minimum acceptable price. The maximum willingness to pay on the demand curve for each bag of oranges up to Q1 exceeds the corresponding minimum acceptable price on the supply curve. Thus, each of these bags adds a positive amount, okay, to the total of consumer and producer surplus. The fact that maximum willingness to pay exceeds the minimum acceptable price for every unit up to Q1 means that people gain more utility from producing and consuming those units than they would if they produced and consumed anything else that could be made with the resources that went into making those units. Okay. So when you look at that perspective, anything until Q1 here, you see, here the marginal benefit, any point here is higher than the marginal cost, the cost of producing bag of oranges, because people get more benefit than the resources allocated and you need to cover the cost. So, as long as the maximum willingness to pay exceeds the minimum acceptable price, people are willing to pay more to consume a unit of good in question than they would pay to consume anything else that could be made with the same resources. Only at equilibrium quantity Q1, quantity 1, where the maximum willingness to pay exactly equals the minimum acceptable price, does society exhaust all opportunities to produce units for which benefits exceed cost. Producing Q1 units therefore achieves allocative efficiency because the market is producing and distributing only those units that make people happier with the bags of oranges that they would be with anything else that could be produced with the same resources. Okay, so in the context of looking at that both areas in terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus, we can say here total surplus. Total surplus is when Q1 units is produced is going to be the maximum surplus you can get from the society. Not only consumers but producers, both of them together. Okay, when demand curves reflect buyers' full willingness to pay and when supply curves reflect all the costs facing sellers, competitive markets produce equilibrium quantities that maximize the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Allocative efficiency occurs at the market equilibrium quantity where three conditions, we need to have three conditions, and these three conditions met at the equilibrium outcome. The first one is marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. Second, the maximum willingness to pay is equal to minimum acceptable price. And the third one is total surplus is maximized. Total surplus, the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus, is maximized. That's why market outcomes are efficient. Okay, that is the outcome that makes everybody happy, maximizes all the surplus, and marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. Here in this figure, you'll realize that if the market outcome is not Q1, which is the equilibrium 1, but instead the market outcome is Q2, and there is going to be an efficiency loss in that case. So efficiency losses, reductions of combined consumer and producer surplus, results from both underproduction and overproduction. Look at that figure. That figure analyzes the case of underproduction by considering what happens if output falls from the efficient level Q1 to the smaller amount Q2. When that happens, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, which as you know, the sum of consumer and producer surplus will be the if it's the market price, will be the sum of these two triangles, which is the big triangle A, B, and C. But when it is the market outcome. But when the market outcome is Q2, there's going to be a reduction in the total surplus. Why? If you look at the figure, you realize that this gray area is going to be a loss, because now the consumer and producer surplus, total surplus, will shrink to the area of A, D, E, and C. You see this area now, it's both the consumer and producer surplus. So the gray area is going to be a deadweight loss. We use that term, deadweight loss. Okay. So for output levels from Q2 to Q1, consumers' maximum willingness to pay, as reflected by points on the demand curve, exceeds producers' minimum acceptable price, as reflected by points on the supply curve. By failing to produce units of this product for which a consumer is willing to pay more than a producer is willing to accept, society suffers a loss of net benefits. As a concrete example, consider a particular unit for which a consumer is willing to pay $10 and the producer is willing to accept $6. So the $4 difference between those values is a net benefit that will not be realized if this unit is not produced. Okay? If you don't produce this unit, $4 of benefit is not going to be realized. And that is the case because you are not producing that unit. You are producing under. The production is less than the equilibrium production. Okay? So that creates a total loss of DBE. That is the gray shaded triangle. Let's think about overproduction. Instead of Q1 units, Q3 units are produced in this economy. Okay. And in this figure, combined consumer and producer surplus is going to decline by the triangle again, BFG, the shaded gray area, gray triangle to the right of Q1. This triangle subtracts from the total consumer and producer surplus of A, B, C. That is my total surplus if the equilibrium quantity is Q1. So that is for all units from 0 to Q1, benefits exceed costs, so these units generate an economic surplus shown by the triangle ABC. Okay. The total, thus they generate, so when you look at the units from Q1 to Q3, these are the units that cost, which is supply, here is the supply, is higher than the benefit, which is the benefit, exceed the benefits. Thus, they generate an economic loss shown by the triangle BFG. So, total economic surplus for all units from 0 to Q3 is therefore the economic surplus by ABC minus the economic loss given by BFG. So, this is a positive, but this side is negative because the cost, which is represented marginal cost, or the supply curve, is higher than marginal benefits. So, here is a negative sign. Okay, so producing any unit beyond Q1 generates an economic loss because the willingness to pay for such units on the part of consumers is less than the minimum acceptable price to produce such units on the part of producers. As a concrete example, note that producing an item for which the maximum willingness to pay is, say, $7 and the minimum acceptable price, say, $10, you produce that unit. Okay, and this minus $3 will be subtracted from the society's net benefit. Such production is uneconomical and creates an efficiency loss for society. Because the net benefit of each bag oranges from Q1 to Q3 is negative, we know that the benefits from these units are smaller than the opportunity cost of the other products that could have been produced with the resources that were used to produce those bags of oranges. The resources used to produce the bags from Q1 to Q3 could have generated net benefit instead of net losses if they had been directed toward producing other goods. That is the main issue. Okay. So here, as you see, markets outcome are efficient is because it is maximizing the total surplus and all resources are used in the best way. That's why it's efficient.